It's almost here, the budget. We're going to hear the full budget handed down tomorrow, albeit we're getting various snippets, including on economic forecasts, and they're not the best for the country. Joining me now is Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume for more on this. Thanks very much for your time. What do you make of some of these forecasts? I mean, in particular on growth, it's downgraded next year to 1.5%. It seems basically because of inflation and rising interest rates that's happening. Is it fair to say that's not Labor's fault? They've inherited this?
Well, Tom, what we want to see in the budget tomorrow is the government building on the coalition's good track record. When we left government, we left it in a very positive position. The economy was chugging along. Unemployment had a 3 in front of it and was on its way down. There was improvements to the budget bottom line. We still had that AAA credit rating. So we want to make sure that the budget builds upon that. We also want to see it address inflation, which is the most insidious economic feature of any economy. And most importantly, we also want to see a focus on productivity, on productive investments, so that we can improve that economic growth outlook for the future. Because unless you get economic growth and inflation working in the right trajectory, well, then you're going to have a consistently deteriorating budget bottom line and a consistently deteriorating economy. You've
called in the past couple of weeks, including here on Newsday, for a responsible approach. You know, let's not throw too much spending at the issue. And it seems Labor's going to do that. No, they're fulfilling their commitments in the election, as you'd expect, on some spending there, and they're finding savings. What do you make of the approach they've taken there?
Well, you have to tailor your budget to suit the times that you're in. And when they went to the election, they promised an additional $18 billion in spending on top of anything the coalition had committed to. Now, I would have thought that if there was this genuine deterioration that they are concerned about, if the economic forecasts are so gloomy, if inflation really is as high as they are saying that it is, well, then you would tailor those expectations about what it is that you would spend, about what it is that they would spend, because that really means that the your fiscal policy isn't necessarily working in line with your monetary policy. And of course, if they don't get this right, well then Philip Lowe's job next Tuesday is going to be made that much harder.
But haven't they done that through finding the savings, essentially?
Well, how much of these savings are going to be permanent? How much of them are actually addressing that constant budget bottom line?
But the inflation issue is
just a reorganisation or realignment towards Labor's priorities.
Well, sure, but the argument around inflation, the issue is right now. It's not. We'll talk about structural deficit in a moment, but what they're doing is whatever spending's coming in, they're actually finding some offsets. This is what you wanted to happen, wasn't it?
I think that's actually fundamentally important, and one of the things that we want to understand is, has the expenditure decisions that have been made by this government, have they found budget offsets for those decisions? And what's the process around that? That's something that we will be fleshing out.
What about, though, when you say tailor your budget to changing economic circumstances? What promises would it have been acceptable for Labor to scrap from the election campaign compared to now?
Well, I'm not privy to the same level of information from Treasury that I used to be when we were in government. Obviously, when we were in government, and the big issue that we faced was COVID, and we had to adjust our budgetary expectations to suit those circumstances. But everything that we did then was, targeted and temporary. It was proportionate, and it was scalable, and it was delivered in a time-effective and efficient way through tax and transfer rails. But we did that so that when COVID was over, that we would see an improvement in the budget bottom line and a reduction in debt, and we did see that. But now the pressures that are facing this Labor government are different to the ones that faced us.
But I mean, let's just go through some of their promises. Cheaper medicines. You wouldn't, if they scrapped that pledge, you would have said Labor's making the cost of living harder. You wouldn't have given them a pass on that, would you?
Well, that's right. We want to see cost of living measures, but we want to see them in a sensible budget.
There's childcare. That doesn't start till the middle of next year, so that won't overheat things now. Again, if they'd scrapped that, you would have said, well, you've broken your promise.
Each decision has an effect on the budget in some way or shape or another. It might be, push up inflationary expectations. It might push up economic growth, or it might not be as effective as possible. For instance, there are a number of measures that you'd want to see the modelling on whether they're improving participation as well as productivity, not just equity. And childcare is one of them. Now, I'm all for a fair and reasonable childcare system that allows both accessibility and affordability for all Australian families. But you want to make sure that you structure that commitment just right to ensure that it's creating productive capacity in the economy and not, in fact...
Right. But I guess the point is, what you're saying essentially is times have got harder, so Labor should break some election promises. I mean, if they'd done that, you would have been pretty vigorous in saying they've broken promises.
Well, it entirely depends on what promises
so they can break
broke.
some, but not others.
And in fact, if Labor came to us and said that we are going to make some spending cuts in particular areas, well, we would look at that in a very open-minded way, because we know that budget repair is a priority.
Okay. Do any of them particulars stand out that you wish they weren't going ahead with?
Really, it's up to them to
no, but I'm
make
asking
that decision.
You. They're keeping all their commitments.
Well, it's up to them to make the decision as to what it is that they're going to prioritise and what it is that they aren't going to prioritise. When we were in government, we knew what our priorities were. They need to make their priorities clear now.
Well, they have. They're keeping their election promises.
And if that's the case and they decide to sacrifice the budget bottom line to do so, well, then there's implications for that.
There's some waste out there, isn't there? I mean, what about commuter car parks? They weren't merit-based. Getting rid of some of those projects is fair enough, isn't it?
Well, actually, I think that's a really, that's an easy sledge. In fact, that there were, there are plenty of infrastructure programs out there, whether they be in the regions or whether they be in the suburbs, that did improve productivity, that did make people's lives easier. Now, if Labor have decided to scrap some of those, that's fine. But then how can you? But then they have to be able to justify it on the basis of efficiencies. And quite frankly, if you've got a commitment to a $2.2 billion suburban rail loop that hasn't gone through Infrastructure Australia, even though that's the body that Anthony Albanese himself set up to judge whether there was economic benefit in infrastructure projects. It hasn't gone
that's
through
a fair enough criticism.
Australia.
We're trying to put that to the minister.
It's a very important one to put through to the minister.
But I'm talking about the stuff they are cutting in. Would you really defend commuter car parks and hand on heart say it was a merit-based scheme? Well, it depends what it is that they are doing. Well, look, it depends on the individual program. And, I don't think you can talk about it. Well, I don't think you can talk about it as an overall scheme without understanding what the individual project is. And there were lots of projects in that field. But the most important thing is... Do you accept there was
some of that infrastructure is being reprioritised and reappropriated elsewhere, and some of it is going back to the budget bottom line. Now, that is fine, that's terrific, but I want to be able to see the modelling that demonstrates that there is a productive capacity that is being invested in, as opposed to just a political, putting a political lens rather than economic.
Commuter car parks, though, as an entirely merit-based program that should not have any cuts from it.
We're not talking about one car park, Tom. We're talking about lots of different projects that were part of the Urban Congestion Fund, and quite frankly, getting people home safer and quicker, getting them to work more easily and more cost effectively. There's merit in that too.
That's a
very easy sledge. It's a very easy
Excel
sledge.
spreadsheet with the top 20 marginal seats and saying anyone got some projects.
Well, I don't know whether that's how that project worked, Tom. And again, I think that might be a little bit politically easy.
Well, that's what the Audit Office suggested. But what about structural deficit? Is this the thing we need to fix, and is that essentially a longer-term project for you as Shadow Finance? I mean, is the NDIS sustainable right now?
I don't think anyone would say that the NDIS is sustainable. Certainly that's not what Bill Shorten is saying, and that's why he has ordered a review. I think that is a welcome commitment coming from this government. There is no reason, though, to say that spending's out of control, nothing we can do, shrug your shoulders and say, oh, well, we might have to raise taxes. The last thing that the economy needs right now is increased taxes, because we have to build that productive capacity. So
NDIS not sustainable? Any other obvious areas where you just think the direction we're headed in the budget is no longer tenable?
Well, we know that the Labor government have pointed out 5 areas where they say that spending has increased, and it has increased structurally, if you like. Now, the job of a government, though, is to look at those spending increases and say, well, what can we do about it? How can we improve it? Now, they've spoken about NDIS, and as I said, we've welcomed that. But there is more to your spending priorities than just NDIS, and we would hope that they would put the ruler over all of their spending priorities to make sure that they are, in fact, improving the budget bottom line rather than just letting it blow out and saying, now we have to raise taxes.
But as a longer-term project for you over this term in opposition, isn't that a project for you as well? You can run the rule over these programs to the same extent.
Well, that's exactly what we'll be doing tomorrow during the budget lockup.
But post that, I'm just talking about you'll have your own blueprint for everyone agrees structural deficit needs fixing, and you can come up. You don't need to wait for Labor on this. You can come up with your own ideas, saying here's where we should be.
Well, I'm absolutely certain that when we go to the election, you'll see exactly what our ideas are. But at the moment, our job is to make sure that Labor does exactly what it needs to do, build on the good record of the previous government, control inflation, control spending, and ideally give cost of living relief to Australians, because that's their most important issue right now.